Welcome to this trip through one of the scariest cases in Appalachian history. The year is 1921, and the mountains are dark and quiet in East Tennessee. The woods hold secrets that time has not erased. Tell us where you are, because this story will make you think about what you think you know about truth and justice. When Martha Whitlock was 28, her name started to ring out in the foggy valleys of Cocky County. Many people in the area knew her as a woman who worked as a sewist in Newport, which is the largest town in that mountainous area. In those days, everyone in East Tennessee knew everyone else. Even the smallest events were written about in the local papers, and life moved slowly to the beat of the seasons. There is something unique about the Appalachians that has always been there. Peaks covered in fog, deep valleys carved by icy streams, and winding, narrow paths between old oak trees. It was a lovely spot, but it was also very alone. A wagon could barely fit on the dirt roads, and going from, it might take days to get from one town to another. Newport, a town of about 2,000 people that relied on farming, logging, and a small amount of trade to stay alive, was nestled in between these hills. Martha lived in a small log cabin on the edge of Newport, close to the road that went to Parrottsville. It was a simple building with 2 windows in the front and a small porch where she often sat in the summer. Her neighbors said she was quiet but friendly. In a quiet room, people were already talking about how she had never been married. People were interested in single women over 25 years old. Late in March of that year, Martha was going to a meeting at the Methodist church in her area, which was usual for people who lived in a very religious area. It was Thursday. The temperature had dropped a lot the night before, and there were thick clouds in the sky that made it look like it might rain. Martha told Mrs. Ellenina Hayes, a neighbor, that she was going to walk to church around 5 o'clock that afternoon. Ellenina was the last person to see her leave the house. She remembers Martha having on a dark skirt, a gray wool coat, and a small cloth bag. They talked for a short time about the weather and the pastor's planned lecture for that night. Even though Martha might have been a little tired, she didn't seem out of the ordinary. Ellenina went back to the house while she kept going down the dirt road toward the church. That night, Martha never showed up at the Methodist church. The minister waited for her for almost an hour and wondered why she kept coming. After the meeting was over, and some people started to talk because Martha didn't show up, but no one thought anything important had happened. In the end, she could have changed her mind, been sick, or just chosen not to go. Martha worked at a small sewing shop with clients. It wasn't until the next day that she didn't show up for work that everything went off. Judy Brennan, who owns the shop, went to Martha's house around noon. There was no answer when she knocked on the door several times. The window was. The house was quiet when it was shut. When Judith got back to town, she called Thomas Callahan, the sheriff, to say that Martha was lost. Sheriff Callahan was a strong, middle-aged man with a thick beard who thought things through. He knew Martha by sight and knew that she was a normal person, with 2 assistants by their side. That same afternoon, he went to her house. The door was opened. Everything seemed fine on the inside. There were plates to wash, clothes to fold, and the bed to make. None of the signs of a fight, flight, or any other kind of trouble. But something didn't seem right. They found a half-empty mug on the kitchen table with some tea still in the bottom. There was a piece of bread next to it that looked like it had only been bitten once, as if Martha had been stopped in the middle of a simple meal and never came back. In an old notebook, the sheriff wrote down these facts. At the time, no one knew what they meant. The loss quickly became known to many people. Newport didn't have enough room to hide things. Within 48 hours, almost the whole town knew. That Martha Whitlock had been seen nowhere. Search teams were put together. The paths, the dense woods, and the banks of the French Broad River that ran through the area were cleaned up by farmers, merchants, and even the town blacksmith. They looked for 3 days straight, from dawn until dusk, but they found nothing. Small blurbs started to appear in local newspapers. The city's weekly newspaper, the Newport Plain Talk, wrote a vague story about the disappearance in its April 2nd issue, asking anyone with information to come forward. Who have information to come forward? It was easy for Martha to describe. She is about 5 feet 10 inches tall, has dark brown hair and light brown eyes. She was last seen wearing a gray coat and a dark skirt. At the same time, Sheriff Callahan began a more formal probe. He talked to Elena Hayes, and she told him again about the casual goodbye on Thursday afternoon. He talked to the Methodist church minister, Martha's co-workers, and business owners who knew her. What they said was the same. Martha had someone who is quiet, works hard, and doesn't have any known enemies. There were no known wars, bills, or personal issues that could have caused someone to disappear. But there were whispers, as there always are in small towns. Some people said Martha was writing to a man in Knoxville, but no one was sure who he was. Some people said in whispers that she had been seen talking to a traveling salesman who had been through the area a few weeks before. People are telling hazy, unproven stories because they are uncomfortable as a group. Deal with the unexplainable. The sheriff also looked into the idea that Martha might have just run away to start over somewhere else. It made sense as an idea. Some single women, especially in more traditional areas, felt the pressure of social standards and left on their own. But this idea didn't hold up very well. Martha had left her savings in a cookie jar in a closet. It cost $140, which was a lot of money at the time. People who plan to leave never leave their money behind. After a few weeks, the case started to lose its heat. The search was put on hold. Newport life went back to normal, but people still whispered Martha Whitlock's name in quiet talks, and there was always an awkward silence. Callahan kept the case open, but he couldn't do much because there were no new clues. Then something strange happened. William Dutch, a hunter, was hiking a hard-to-reach mountain trail about 5 miles north of Newport at the end of April. He was after animal tracks when he saw something strange in the trees. As he got closer, he saw a cloth bag partly buried under wet leaves and broken branches. It belonged to Martha Whitlock. William Dutch took the bag to the Newport Sheriff's office right away. He put the thing on the scratched wooden table with shaking hands. Sheriff Callahan carefully looked at every single thing. Even though the bag was dirty and wet, it was still easy to find. They found a handkerchief with Martha's letters embroidered on it, some loose coins, and a small mirror that is broken. Not a thing else. The finding gave the investigation a new sense of urgency. A new search was set up by the sheriff, this time focused on the area where the bag had been found. That area was very unfriendly because it was full of thick greenery and deep valleys. The tracks were mostly used by experienced hunters and a few families who lived in cabins in the middle of nowhere at higher elevations. For 5 days, volunteers looked through that forest's whole surface area. They walked in a line, their eyes fixed on the leaf-covered ground as they looked for any clues about what had happened to Martha. It wasn't nice outside. The ground was slippery because it rained a lot, and mountain fog made it impossible to see more than a few meters ahead. One of the helpers found pieces of gray fabric stuck to a thorn bush about 2 kilometers from the main trail on the 3rd day of the search. The material fit what was said about. The coat Martha wore the night she went missing. The sheriff put up wooden stakes to mark the spot and widen the search area. Things were getting worse. No one was sure what they were getting closer to, but everyone felt like they were. Then they found something that would change everything. Early in the morning, on May 7th, 2 sheriff's officers found a clearing tucked away among old rocks. Even the best shooters wouldn't go there because it was so far away. There, partly hidden by trees, and Martha Whitlock was hidden by plants that someone had clearly planned to hide. Sheriff Callahan was called right away. Dr. Harrison Mills, a neighborhood doctor who also served as coroner in the few cases that called for it, climbed into the clearing with him. The scene was scary not because of the violence that could be seen, but because there was complete silence around it. In a way that looked almost planned, Martha was lying on her back with her hands crossed over her chest. Her gray coat was torn. In a few places, her skirt was dirty. Under the filtered light of the treetops, Dr. Mills did a preliminary check right there. For almost an hour, he worked alone and took careful notes in a notebook he hid in the pocket of his jacket. It was hard to say exactly when the person died because the body showed signs of being out in the weather for a long time. There were no clear signs of serious violence, but Mills saw marks on the neck that made him think the person might have been strangled. The word got around. It went through Newport as quickly as a blaze in the mountains. The next day, the local newspaper put out a special issue with the story taking up half of the front page. The streets were full of people. On street corners, people got together and talked about what might have happened. People in the community were scared. Anyone could have this happen to them if it could happen to Martha Whitlock. He put together a small command post in a back room of City Hall. There were maps of the area on the walls, with colored pins on them, pointing out important locations. The Methodist Church, Martha's house, the spot where the purse was found, and the last field. He started making maps of possible routes to try to figure out how Martha got off the main road and into this remote area. There was a different sense of urgency when the talks started up again. The sheriff talked to Eleanor Hayes again and asked her about everything that happened that March afternoon. Eleanor told the same story again, but this time she added something that didn't seem important the first time. I saw a strange man in the area that same week, I remembered. Someone she said was tall, wore a dark hat, and had a big backpack on them. He had asked Eleanor for directions, but she couldn't remember where they were. Other people in the area started reporting seeing the same things. A farmer named Henry Morrison said a few days before the person went missing that he saw a stranger camping near the French Broad River. Joseph Crane, the town's blacksmith, said he fixed a belt buckle for a visitor who fit the description, but no one knew the man's name, where he was from, or where he was going. After taking the body to his office in Newport, Dr. Mills did his most thorough exam. The findings in his report, which was written in tight cursive, didn't answer any questions. Most likely the person died of asphyxiation, which could have been caused by strangulation, but the body's state made it impossible to be sure. Mills was interested in the fact that there were no other defensive scars. Martha's nails were still whole, and there were. No scratches, which means the fight lasted a long time. He also saw something strange. Martha wasn't wearing any shoes when she was found, and there were only small marks on her feet. There is nothing that fits with a long walk on rough ground. No one ever found her shoes. A scary theory was born from this finding. It's possible that Martha hadn't gone to that area by herself. She might have been dragged away, knocked out, or unable to fight back. Sheriff Callahan chose to look at the records of people coming and going from the area. There was no. He didn't have official control over who came and went from Newport. But he did talk to the owners of the town's 2 boarding houses, the boss of the Morristown train station, and stagecoach drivers who often went through the area. No one knew of any strangers who were especially suspicious, but a lot of tourists went through the area every week. There was also a look into Martha's personal life. The sheriff got permission to look through her letters that were kept in a wooden box in her house. He found letters that he had written to a cousin in Chattanooga. The letters were about sewing orders and included payment records. There was no sign of strife or danger. There were, however, 3 letters from Knoxville from someone who signed their name only as J. There was friendly banter in the letters about the weather and social events, but they were written in a way that made it seem like the writers knew each other well, like they were close. What did J do? The sheriff used the letter's postmark to try to figure out where it came from, but they came from several different Knoxville agencies, so it was hard to find out who sent them. He went to that city, which is the biggest in East Tennessee, and spent 3 days giving details about Martha's appearance and asking around about people he might know. The search didn't turn up anything. It was like looking for a straw in a haystack to find someone in Knoxville, which had more than 70,000 people living in it. At the same time, ideas started to spread around Newport. Some people thought Martha had set up a secret meeting with this strange J, and something went horribly wrong. Some people thought she had been in the wrong place at the wrong time and been the victim of a chance crime. Some even talked about old mountain customs and dark stories about sacrifices and strange agreements that had been passed down from generation to generation. Even though the sheriff said these were just beliefs, he couldn't deny how much they showed fear. During the probe, a strange fact came to light. Martha took $50 out of her account, savings for 2 weeks before she went missing. She took the money out of the bank in Newport in cash, which the clerk remembered very well because it was a large amount. The money was never found because Martha didn't say why she took it out. It wasn't in her bag, it wasn't at her house, it wasn't on her. Where did that cash go? The sheriff started to think about the idea of bribery. Maybe Martha was being pushed by someone to pay for a secret she didn't want to share. Hide. The idea was scary, but it made sense. He talked to everyone who knew Martha again and asked about any changes in her behavior that might mean she was scared or worried. It was always the same answer. Martha seemed fine. She had been a little quieter lately, but that wasn't a big deal. As May went on, Sheriff Callahan's anger grew along with it. It looked like every lead ended in nothing. Every witness kept saying things that didn't lead anywhere. He was under more and more heat. People in Newport wanted answers. They wanted to know if there was a killer among them and if their own families were in danger. Women in the town stopped going out alone and started going out in groups. By the time it got dark, the streets were empty. An unexpected turn came from a place you wouldn't expect it. A woman named Ruth Pendleton went to the police on May 23rd with a scary story. Ruth lived in a cabin in the woods, about 3 miles from Newport. She rarely came into town. She was a widow who farmed a small piece of land and kept chickens to make ends meet On March 31st, Ruth was coming home from visiting a friend when she heard something strange coming from the woods. It sounded like a muffled scream, and then there was a heavy quiet. Ruth stopped on the path, her heart racing, to try to figure out where the sound had come from. That night, the moon was just starting to rise, so it wasn't easy to see through the thick trees. She waited for a while but didn't hear anything else. Ruth was scared, so she ran back to her house and locked all the doors. She was going to Newport the next day to tell what happened, but she was sure it was just a forest animal. After a few weeks, Ruth went down to town and heard about Martha Whitlock. That's when she started to believe what she was seeing. The date was the same as the night she never came back. The scream she heard came from somewhere between the main road and the area where Martha was found. Ruth felt bad that she hadn't spoken up sooner, but the sheriff soothed her. He wrote on. It showed on the map about where Ruth had been when she heard the sound, adding another piece to the dark puzzle. With this new knowledge, the sheriff came up with a theory about how things happened. After leaving her house around 5 p.m., Martha walked along the road to the church. Someone caught her along the way at some point. It could have been someone she knew and trusted enough to go off the main path. Or maybe she was forced or threatened in a way that no one saw. The policeman. went back to the road that goes from Martha's house to the Methodist church and paid extra attention to every yard. It was about 2 kilometers long and mostly went through sparsely populated residential areas. There was also a longer, more quiet stretch covered by trees. He looked for places where Martha could have been pushed off the road without being seen. 3 things were possible: a branch that led to an old, empty sawmill, a side path that hunters used, and a narrow path that went through an empty. Real estate. All of these options were looked into by Callahan. The old sawmill was mostly made up of rotting wood, and the broken windows let wind and rain in. There were a lot of leaves and animal droppings on the ground. There were no signs that people had been there recently. The hunter's trail also didn't lead anywhere important, but the path through the empty land did lead to an interesting discovery. Arnold Hutchkins owned the land, but he had moved to Kentucky 2 years before and hadn't used it since. The grass was too long, the fence was broken in a few places, and a small storage building was only half there. The deputy found fresh burn marks, empty cans, and an old blanket rolled up in a spot inside the storage building. The place had been used as a temporary home by someone. The finding was important. The sheriff told his officers to check out all the local stores and see who bought food in the last few weeks of March. The old man who owned the general store was called Patrick. O'Brien remembered a person he hadn't seen before. The man bought some candles, bread, cheese, and canned beans. He paid with cash and didn't say much, just that he was going through. The description fit the strange man that other people had talked about. The man was tall, wore a dark hat, and didn't look like he stood out in any way. The sheriff began to make a history. This man probably got to Newport a few days before Martha went missing. He briefly set up shop in the empty warehouse. From there, he could watch the traffic on the road without being seen. What did he have to do with Martha, though? Was he the mystery J in the letters, or was he just a criminal looking for an easy target? In order to try to find answers, the sheriff chose to put an ad in newspapers in nearby towns. The writing was easy. People were asked for details about a guy who was about 6 feet tall and between 30 and 40 years old. He might be traveling alone through East Tennessee near the end of March. Tell the sheriff's office in Newport anything you know. The ad ran in 4 newspapers in the area, including the Knoxville Journal, the Morristown Gazette, and one more. After a week, people started to respond. Most of them didn't make sense. People reported sightings that didn't fit the times or descriptions. However, Callahan was most interested in one letter. The house was in Siviewville, which is about 30 miles south of Newport. Margaret Foster is the owner. Wrote that someone who fit the description had stayed at her business for 3 nights in early March. As soon as he could, the sheriff went to Seviawville. Margaret Foster was a careful middle-aged woman who kept thorough lists of all the people who came to her house. She showed Callahan the guest book and wrote that a man named James Thornton had stayed from March 6th to March 9th. He gave cash, stayed alone, and left without leaving an address where they could be reached. What does the name James Thornton mean? Be the J in the words? It was an interesting prospect. Even though it had been more than 2 months and the room had been used by other guests, the sheriff asked for permission to check out the room where the man had stayed. He still looked very carefully, though, going through every drawer and corner. That is, until he looked in the small spot between the bed and the wall. A small piece of paper with writing on it was lying there, forgotten. A torn piece of a letter was lying on the ground. The words were. There were not many, but there were enough to make the sheriff's heart beat fast. Meet at the place we talked about on Thursday after dark. Bring what we agreed on. Martha, don't let me down. The sheriff's hands were shaking as he held the paper. There was clear proof that Martha had set up a meeting with someone on purpose, but the rest of the letter was missing, so it was impossible to tell who wrote those words or what exactly Martha was supposed to bring to the meeting. The $50 she took out was used for something else. Once more in Newport, Callahan showed the piece to a few people who knew Martha's handwriting. All of them agreed that it wasn't her work. That message was sent to Martha, not the other way around. This meant that Martha wasn't just going to church that Thursday. She had a secret meeting planned. So, did she go to the meeting or was she stopped before she got there? The sheriff also noticed something about the way the message was written. If you hear the words, "Don't let me down," they sound like a threat. Psychological stress. It was written by someone with power over Martha, like they made her do what they said, even though she didn't want to. Was it a threat, a debt, or something more evil? As I worked to solve these mysteries, another piece of information came to light out of the blue. A lumber dealer who did business in several East Tennessee towns came up to the sheriff with an interesting tale. His name was Douglas Freeman, and he knew about the case from reading the news. Doug told her he had met Martha Whitlock a few months ago when they went to Knoxville. At a social event, they had briefly talked, and Martha had said she was worried about a tough family situation. Doug Freeman sat in the worn-out chair across from the desk of the sheriff, his hat resting on his knees. When he thought about that conversation with Martha, he seemed really upset. He said they met at a party in Knoxville in late January of that year that was put together by a group of merchants. Martha had a client with her who had brought her to make more business contacts. The two of them talked for about 20 minutes during a break. Martha had cautiously and vaguely said that she had a complicated family situation with land ownership. Even though she didn't say more, Douglas got the main point of her worry. There seemed to be a fight over a piece of land that belonged to Martha's parents who had died many years before. Someone was questioning whether or not the ownership was real and claimed ownership rights. Martha seemed worried and said she was. She was trying to settle the case without going to court because she didn't have the money for a long legal process. By revealing this, a new line of inquiry was made possible. Sheriff Callahan knew that people often got violent when they fought over land in the Tennessee mountains. Families had fought over unclear boundaries, disputed inheritances, and documents that didn't seem to be real. If Martha was involved in this, she might not have known it, but she could have made dangerous enemies. What Callahan did. There was a brick building in downtown Newport that was the Corky County Clerk's office. It held old, dusty records from decades ago. He looked through property records for 2 whole days, looking for any mention of the Whitlock name. He finally found what he was looking for. A deed from 1897 that showed Martha's parents, Samuel and Elizabeth Whitlock, buying about 20 acres of land. The land was tucked away in the mountains northeast of Newport. The sheriff was interested in notes written in the margins in 1919, just 2 years ago. Someone had officially disputed the property, saying that the original lines were wrong and that a large part of the land actually belonged to a property next door. The person in dispute was a man named Elias Thornton, who lived in Parrotsville. He had the same last name as the person who had stayed at the boarding house in Sevierville. Was it a chance event? There were no such things as coincidences in the eyes of the sheriff. He looked. I looked at the records more carefully and found that Elias Thornton did, in fact, own land that was next to the Whitlock property. The argument was about a place where there were signs of mineral deposits that could be valuable if they were used correctly. The next morning, Callahan went to Parrotsville with one of his helpers. The town wasn't even as big as Newport. It was just a few houses along a main road. A few miles from the center was Elias Thornton's land, a simple farm with fields that were being farmed and a wooden house that is well taken care of. They were met by a woman in her 50s who said her name was Sarah Thornton and that she was Elias's wife. Sarah invited them in and offered them coffee, but they politely turned it down. The sheriff talked about the investigation into Martha Whitlock to explain why he was there. Sarah's face changed right away, and a shadow went across it. She said she knew Martha by sight and knew about the land dispute, but her husband had given up the fight months before. Long time ago. She said that Elias had decided that the legal fees were not worth it, and that the case should be dropped. Callahan asked Sarah if she could talk to Elias. Sarah thought about it for a moment before answering. Her husband wasn't there. He went to Virginia 2 months ago to look for work in coal mines, but he still hadn't come back. They wrote each other letters from time to time, so she didn't know exactly when he would come back. The most recent one she got was sent in mid-April and had a date on it. They are from Norton, a town close to the border between Virginia and Kentucky. The sheriff asked Elias if he had a brother or other family member named James. Sarah made a thoughtful frown. Elias did have a younger brother named James Thornton, but he hadn't seen him in years. James lived a nomadic life, showing up sometimes to borrow money and then going away again. Sarah hadn't seen him in over a year and had no idea where he was. When asked to describe James's looks, she said he was tall, thin, and wearing hats with wide brims. The description fit the man in question. Callahan asked to see Elias's letters from Virginia before he left. Sarah brought 3 envelopes, and the sheriff was able to read what was inside them. The letters were simple. They were about how hard they worked in the mines, how bad the conditions were, and how much they missed home. There was no evidence that they had anything to do with Martha's disappearance, but the sheriff saw the postmarks. The first letter was sent on February 28th, and the second on March 20th, and the third on April 15th. Between the second and third letters, there was a long break that covered the exact time that Martha went missing. When he got back to Newport, the sheriff put his results in order. It was now clear what the Thorntons had to do with Martha Whitlock. The land argument had made people angry, even though it hadn't turned into a lawsuit. James Thornton, Elias's lost brother, was in the area at the exact moment the person went missing. He might have written the letters to Martha signed as J, potentially to get money from her in exchange for dropping the ownership dispute. But something didn't seem to make sense. Why would James kill Martha if all he wanted was money? The title problem wasn't solved by her death. The land would stay the same. The property would eventually go to other relatives or be claimed by the county, unless there was something else going on that the sheriff didn't fully understand yet. This made him decide to look at the Whitlock property again. Along with Callahan rode to the farm with 2 helpers one June afternoon. Since Martha's parents died years ago, the house had been empty for years. The family's old house had partly collapsed, leaving only weak walls and a roof that leaked. There were now plants and young trees growing where there used to be flower beds. The 3 men carefully looked around the area. They walked along the property line to see where the disputed line was with the Thorntons' land. It was a rough piece of. The land went around the shape of a rock outcrop. At first, there didn't seem to be anything useful there, just a thick forest and rough ground. Then, near the ridge's highest point, an aide named Robert Hayes saw something strange. The ground had marks on it. Recently, the earth has been moving in ways that seemed planned. Not long ago, someone dug there. The marks were in the shape of a rectangle, which suggests that something was hidden and then taken out. They were told by the sheriff to dig deeper and look for anything that could be hidden. They dug for almost an hour and found something at the bottom of the hole in the hot June sun. It was a rusty metal box like the ones people keep important papers in. Even though the lid was locked, Robert used an iron bar to open it. Inside, old papers were kept safe by waxed paper. The sheriff carefully looked at each one. They had things that had to do with the Whitlock estate, like the original purchase deed, tax records, and letters that Samuel Whitlock and the old property. The most important paper, though, was at the bottom of the box. It was a deal for mineral rights from 1895, which is 2 years before Samuel Whitlock actually bought the land. The deal said that the person who owned that piece of the land had the only right to any minerals found in a 50-acre area that included parts of what would become the Thornton property. The paper was signed by someone from a mining company in North Carolina. Finally, the sheriff got those mining rights. Were valuable. Maybe even very valuable. In the 1920s, people wanted more coal and other minerals, so that deal could be worth a lot of money. If someone knew about the document and wanted to steal it, they would have a good reason to commit a major crime. When the metal box was found, it totally changed the investigation. Sheriff Callahan stayed in his office all night reading papers by the dim light of a gas lamp and making careful notes on every piece of paper. He had to find out exactly what these mining rights meant and who else might know about them. The next morning, the sheriff went to find Herbert Dalton, a local lawyer who had a small shop on Newport's main street. Dalton knew a lot about mines and property issues because he had worked for years to settle land disputes in the mountains. The lawyer's eyes got really big when Callahan showed him the 1895 contract. Dalton said that this kind of contract was very important. In the early 1900s, mining companies often sold exploration rights for very little money because they had no idea how much those lands would be worth years or even decades later. Because of the growth of the coal industry and the finding of large mineral deposits in the mountains of eastern Tennessee, that document could make its owner very rich. Dalton thought that the rights it talked about might be worth $5 to $10,000, or even more if there were people who want to buy. The sheriff then asked the very important question, did Martha know about this document? Dalton wasn't sure, but he thought it was possible she didn't. It's possible that Martha would have used the mineral rights to get out of her modest poverty if she had known how much that box buried on her parents' land was really worth. She kept working as a seamstress and living in a simple house, which showed that she didn't know about the possible wealth that was buried under her land. Someone did know about that deal, though, and they were determined to get it no matter what. The sheriff then turned his attention to the Thornton brothers. Elias, the oldest, was the one who had started the legal case against the land. He must have been hungry for more land, or did he know about the mining rights and James, the brother who had gone astray? What did he have to do with any of this? Callahan chose to learn more about James Thornton's past. He wrote telegrams to sheriffs in nearby counties and asked if anyone knew of a man with that name. The answers didn't come for a few days, but when they did, they were very upsetting. Small crimes, fraud, theft, and forgery were all things that James Thornton had done in the past. The last time he was in jail, it was 3 years ago, for trying to sell land that didn't belong to him. We could see the start of a pattern. James was a con artist who lived by ripping people off and was always on the lookout for the next easy scam. If he knew that the Whitlock land had mineral rights, he would definitely try to take them. But how did he know? Also, why did Martha agree to meet him that terrible Thursday? After going back to the letters he found in Martha's house that were signed simply J, the sheriff read each one again with a new point of view. The messages were meant to be vague because they were talking about unfinished business or problems that need to be fixed. We will both gain if we work together. Callahan now knew James was being dishonest. Martha, by making her think he had important papers or knowledge about her parents' estate. Likely, he had offered to help her settle the matter with Elias in exchange for money or something else of value. The $50 that Martha took out made sense now. She brought that money to her meeting with James because she thought she could buy peace, or maybe a paper he said he had. However, James did not want $50. He wanted the deal for the mining rights, but Martha most likely didn't. Don't even know where it was or that it was there. The sheriff made a list of what happened in order. James came to the area in early March. His brother may have told him about the Whitlock farm. He stayed in Sevierville at first, then moved closer to Newport and used the empty building as a base. During these weeks, he had been writing to Martha and trying to get her to trust him, or maybe even frightening her in a subtle way. He had planned for the meeting to happen on March 31st evening. Martha had left. She left the house thinking she was going to church, but she was really going to meet James first, probably at the empty building or somewhere else on the road. With the $50 in her hand, she hoped to settle things quickly and still get to church on time. James didn't need money, though. He was looking for details about where the mineral rights contract was. The problem got worse when Martha couldn't or wouldn't give this information. It was still not completely clear what happened at that meeting, but the hero could guess. When James saw that Martha didn't have what he wanted, he got very angry. He might have made her feel threatened by telling her to take him to her parents' house to look. They walked along the mountain paths until they got to the empty lot. James must have made Martha tell him where he thought important papers were hidden. But there was something wrong with this idea. If James already knew where the metal box with the mining rights was, why did he kill Martha? He would have. He already got what he wanted. Unless Martha had seen something and clearly seen his face, and he was trying to keep her from identifying him. Or maybe the death wasn't planned. It could have been caused by a fight that got out of hand, or a panicked moment. The sheriff knew he had to find James Thornton when Martha said she would scream or run away. He sent arrest warrants and thorough descriptions to every town in eastern Tennessee and the states next to it. In the newspaper, he put ads offering a prize for information that led to the getting the suspect. He sent a message to the government in North Carolina, Virginia, Kentucky, and Georgia. James was now the person everyone in the area wanted to catch. Weeks went by with no important news. Summer finally came, and the oppressive heat made the job of investigating even more tiring. People in Newport were still talking about Martha Whitlock's case, but it wasn't as important to them as it used to be. Like it always does, life went on, even though there are still a lot of bad questions. After that on, an email from Asheville, North Carolina came through on July 18th. Someone who looked a lot like James Thornton was caught trying to sell a shady paper to a land speculator. The local police had him in jail while they checked to make sure he was who he said he was. Sheriff Callahan left right away and took a train through the mountains to get to this town in the middle of the Appalachians. He was taken to a cell in the back of the Asheville police station when he got there. Putting up. He was sitting on a narrow bed. He was tall and thin, and his clothes were dirty from traveling. He looked at Callahan with eyes that were both angry and sad. They were dark and calculated. He was asked for his name. The man thought about it for a moment and then said, "James Thornton." Callahan felt a wave of grim satisfaction. He finally had his main suspect in front of him after months of looking and being frustrated. But catching James was just the start. He now had to get him to admit, or, at the very least, get enough proof to get a judgment. He asked for permission to talk to the prisoner alone and question him. The questioning went on for hours. At first, James denied everything. He said he had never been to Newport, didn't know anyone named Martha Whitlock, and that the paper he was trying to sell was something he had found lying on the side of the road. But his lies were weak and full of holes. Callahan presented him with proof, the boarding house register and witnesses who had seen him in Newport. When James signed papers in Asheville, he made copies of his handwriting that he used on letters he sent from Sevierville. Over time, James's front started to crack as the sheriff kept putting pressure on him. He confirmed that he had been in the Newport area, but he said it was just for a short time. He then said he knew Martha, but claimed he had never met her in person. It was hard to get each statement out, and then new lies were told to cover up the old ones. It was a long and hard process, but Callahan, persisted, knowing all the ways to get away. As the questioning went on, night fell over Asheville. Callahan was not in a hurry. At this point, he knew that waiting would help him. James Thornton was getting more and more tense, hungry, and tired. Because he felt guilty and people kept asking him questions, he was clearly getting tired. He had shaking hands as he tried to light a cigarette that the sheriff had given him. Callahan changed his plan. He began to talk to her instead of blaming her directly. About the person Martha. He talked about her simple life in Newport, including how she worked as a seamstress and how she lived alone in a small, simple house. He told her how respected she was in the neighborhood, how often she went to church, and how she had never hurt anyone. The sheriff kept a close eye on James' face as he talked, hoping to see signs of regret or pain. When Callahan talked about the church, James's face changed in a way that I couldn't explain. It was a quick flash that was hard to see, but the sheriff. I got it. He made his point clear. That night, Martha was going to church, right? Thursday came around. She was going to a church meeting, but you stopped her before she got there. James clenched his teeth and looked at the ground. He didn't say anything for a while. The sound of a clock on the wall was the only thing in the room. James finally started to talk. His voice was very low, almost like a whisper. He admitted that he set up the meeting with Martha, but he claimed that his only goal was to negotiate. His brother Elias had told him about seeing old papers while looking through county records for the land dispute, which is how he learned about the mineral rights. James took notice of a chance. He believed he could persuade Martha to sell the rights, which would give him a big bonus. The sheriff paid close attention and wrote down everything that was said. He asked James how he got Martha's address and how he first got in touch with her. James said he was the one who sent the first letter at the beginning of March, describing himself in a vague way as someone who knew important things about his parents' estate. Martha's answer was careful and interesting. They wrote each other a few more letters, with James always writing in a strange but enticing way, as if he had something important to say. Martha wasn't sure at first when James suggested they meet in person, but he persuaded her by saying the information was too private to be written down and that they needed to talk in person. He picked on purpose A. He chose a time when she was likely to be at church so that she could easily wander off for a few minutes without anyone noticing. Martha probably agreed because she thought she could get things done quickly. Everything went as planned at the meeting. James was ready for her near the road split that led to the empty building. He was polite to Martha when she came and suggested they walk to a more private place to talk. She followed him with $50, which she thought would be enough to buy whatever information he had. But the talk quickly turned bad when they got to the warehouse and James told them what he really wanted. James told Martha about the mineral rights deal and said it was worth a lot of money. He also said she should share the money with him in exchange for keeping quiet and helping him deal with the mining companies. Martha didn't understand. She had no idea about the deal. He talked about something I didn't understand. She thought James was having fun with her and that it was all a trick. She wouldn't work with them, saying. Then she was going to leave and tell the sheriff about the attempt to blackmail her. James said that was the point at which everything went wrong. He freaked out. His life of con artistry would be found out if Martha told the police, and he would probably end up back in jail. He grabbed her arm and tried to stop her from going. Martha screamed and tried to get away. They fought for a short time, and James put his hand over her mouth to block out her screams. That's when the mountain widow, Ruth Pendleton, had to have died. Have heard the sound that night that scared her. The sheriff cut him off in the middle of his story. Then you killed her. James scratched his head hard and looked around wide-eyed. That wasn't how it was. I meant not to. I only wanted to keep her still so she wouldn't scream. But she didn't give up, and His voice stopped. He put his hands around his face and shook his shoulders. Callahan stayed put. He knew James was scared because John was about to tell the whole truth. After a short time, James went on. His speech that is jumbled and almost impossible to understand. He said it was true that Martha had died in the building during the fight. He says it was an awful mistake and that he didn't mean to kill her. Upon realizing that she was no longer breathing, he lost all control. He thought about what to do for hours. He couldn't just leave the body there. It would be found out quickly. He had to hide her in order to get away. He took Martha to his wagon and hid it behind the shed. Then he waited until it was well, after midnight. Then he drove through the dark mountain roads. He knew the way because he had been exploring the area for weeks. He almost happened upon that remote clearing by mistake. It was so far away that he thought no one would ever find it. He left Martha there, putting branches over her in a weak attempt to hide her. He took her purse and planned to throw it away somewhere far away. But as he ran away, he just threw it into the woods. The only thing he got was the $50 Martha brought with her for this terrible accident. But James was stuck on mining rights and couldn't get rid of them. In the days that followed, as the search for Martha began, he went back to the empty Whitlock property in secret. He dug and looked for hours before he found the metal box hidden deep down. The deal he had been chasing was inside. He took the paper and left the area, going south through the mountains. He spent months trying to figure out how to make money off of the deal without anyone getting suspicious. He finally made it. He took it to Asheville and tried to sell it to a land speculator by making up a long story about how he got the document. The buyer was suspicious, asked too many questions, and finally called the police. James was caught before the deal could go through. Sheriff Callahan leaned back in his chair and thought about what he had heard. James's statement was a lot like what he thought it would be. A crime motivated by greed and made worse by fear that ended in tragedy and took 2 lives, Martha's directly and James's through what he did and what happened as a result. There was nothing magical or mysterious about it. It was just greedy people being greedy. But there were still questions. James was asked about his brother Elias by the police. Did he understand the plan? Did he have anything to do with it? James rejected it with all his might. He said that Elias had no idea what he had done. His older brother had only briefly talked about old records when he came to visit months before, and James had no idea that would do something so bad with that information. James said he did it by himself because he didn't want to bring his brother along with him. Callahan thought that part was true. He knew guys like James who were con artists who didn't trust their partners and worked alone. Elias Thornton was likely not guilty. He was a good man trying to make a living in the mines in Virginia. The sheriff asked officials in Asheville to officially transcribe James' confession. He had no idea that his brother had used his words as a vague inspiration to kill. He had to. Everything had to be properly written down, signed, and witnessed so that it could be used in court. James fully cooperated, even though he was tired and seemed happy to finally admit. He admitted to killing Martha Whitlock by signing the papers with a shaky hand. The next few days were a blur of legal and administrative work. Sheriff Callahan had to make sure that James Thornton was taken back to Tennessee, that all the evidence was properly categorized, and that the case was ready for trial. He also got the mineral back. James tried to sell a rights contract and kept it as important proof. That faded piece of paper with deep creases and yellowing ink stood for the complicated reason behind it all. The news of the arrest got around quickly. The Newport Plain Talk put out a special issue with shocking headlines saying that the person who killed Martha Whitlock had been caught. The city streets were full of people talking about what was going on. Some were happy that justice had been done, while others were just glad to know that there was no longer any crime going on among them. Early in August, when James was brought back to Newport, there were a few people at the train station. The sheriff had asked people to be careful, but in such a small town it was hard to keep things secret. James got off the train while being led by 2 police officers and handcuffed. He bowed his head to avoid their angry looks. Even though someone in the crowd yelled something mean, Callahan quickly led the prisoner to a closed wagon that would take him straight to the county jail, the cell where James would wait. The trial was very small and simple. It had thick stone walls and one tall window that was blocked with iron bars. He would be alone there for a few months, with his thoughts and the rising weight of what he had done. The sheriff put guards on regular shifts, not so much so that people couldn't get away, but so that no angry citizen would try to do his own justice. Callahan worked to fill in the last few gaps in the study at the same time. He went back to Parrotsville to tell Sarah Thornton that her brother-in-law had been arrested. The woman looked upset by the news. Her hands were shaking as she held a cup of tea that was getting cold without her being drunk. She claimed that she had never thought James would do something so horrible. She had always seen him as a minor bother and a weak but not dangerous man. Sarah also told me something about Elias. The week before, her husband had come back from Virginia, tired but happy to be home. When Elias found out what his brother had done, he was crushed. He talked to the sheriff for a long time and told him that he had nothing to do with James' acts. Elias said that he had only mentioned the old Whitlock estate records in passing while talking with his family, and he had no idea what bad things would happen as a result. The trial was set for October, which gave both the prosecution and the defense time to get ready. A young guy named Robert Mitchell was picked to represent James in court. Just finished, and still very idealistic, dedicated to the idea that everyone should have access to good legal counsel. Mitchell knew his case was very tough, but he worked hard to find any mitigating factors that could change the verdict. The main goal of the defense was to show that Martha's death was not planned and was caused by an incident that sadly got out of hand. Mitchell would say that James didn't mean to kill, that he did what he did out of fear and panic, not on purpose. It was trying to change the charge from intentional murder to something less dangerous is like walking a fine line. Mitchell knew it was his only chance, though. A very experienced lawyer named Theodore Warren built a very different case for the government. Warren said that James was a smart thief who had planned every move, including the shady letters, the secret meeting that was planned to happen when Martha would be by herself, and the choice of a remote location. Warren would say that James had planned the killing, even if it wasn't completely planned. The conditions that allowed the violence to happen were set up on purpose. September came along with the first signs of fall. It started to rain, and the trees in the mountains changed color. This made the slopes look golden and red. Newport's daily life went on as usual, but the trial was always in the background. Lots of people in the area were going to court because they wanted to see how justice would be done. At the same time, Sheriff Callahan worked to settle Martha's assets, with no known. If there are no straight heirs, the land and mineral rights would go back to the county. But the sheriff found out that Martha had a distant cousin in Chattanooga. It was the same cousin that she had been writing to. He called her and told her what was going on. He also told her about the mining rights, which were worth a lot of money. Helen Cartwright, the cousin, went to Newport at the end of September. She was a nice woman in her 40s whose eyes filled with tears when the sheriff showed her the house where Martha had lived. Helen said that she and her cousin were not close and only wrote to each other sometimes, but she had always liked her. She was shocked to find out that Martha had died without knowing how much her parents' fortune was really worth. Helen was given proof by the sheriff that she was related to Martha. This meant she could officially claim the inheritance. There was sadness in Helen's voice as she thanked him. This sudden wealth was tainted with death and sadness, a bitter, She took the gift more out of respect to her family than happiness. Things were tense in the days before the trial. The two-story county courtroom in downtown Newport was ready to hear what was likely to be the most important case in the recent history of the area. The windows were cleaned, the benches were shined, and the papers were carefully put away. Hamilton Pierce, the judge in charge, was known for being serious and fair. He was a gay guy with curly hair who had been a judge for 30 years. The courtroom was open to everyone on the morning of October 3rd. People from Newport and nearby towns quickly crowded into the galleries, fighting for places. Some people got there hours early in the hopes of getting a seat. There was a heavy feeling of anticipation in the air, along with something darker, a hunger for justice that was shared by everyone. With his hands tied, James Thornton was taken from jail. He wore clean clothes that Attorney Mitchell gave him to try to look as good as possible for the jury, but no amount of clothes could hide how much he had changed after being locked up for months. James was thinner and his skin was pale, like he had been out of the sun for too long. He had a sad, faraway look in his eyes. It took 2 full days to choose the jurors. Each candidate was asked a lot of questions about their views, biases, and what they already knew about the case. Warren and Mitchell disagreed with every choice because they knew that these 12 people would decide what would happen to James. In the end, the jury was set up. There were farmers, traders, and a teacher. All of them were men, as was common at the time, and they all promised to judge based only on the information that was shown. The start of the trial was somber. Judge Pierce talked about the case, the defendant's rights, and the duties of the judges. His voice bounced off the wooden walls of the courtroom, and he spoke each word clearly. Theodore Warren then got up to give his opening remarks. He walked slowly up to the panel and looked at each one of them. "Face before you start to talk." Warren said Martha Whitlock was a cruel victim of trickery. He talked about the fake letters and how James had gained her trust only to use her for his own gain. James' lies about mining rights and the attempt to extort money were talked about. Then, Warren spoke in a controlled but emotional tone about how Martha died alone and scared at the hands of a man she had only known through written lies, when Theodore Warren was done with his. The courtroom was quiet during the opening speech. He slowly made his way back to the prosecution's table, letting his words sink in with the jurors. Then it was Robert Mitchell's turn to defend himself. The young lawyer got up, nervously fixed his vest, and walked over to the jury. It was clear that he was young, but his stance showed that he was determined. Mitchell didn't try to hide the facts. Given James's full confession, it would not have made sense. He instead focused on putting a face on his client and showing that this wasn't the story of a monster but of a weak man who did terrible things. In his speech, he talked about James's hard life, his poverty, the bad decisions that led to the small crime, and finally that terrible night when everything went horribly wrong. Mitchell begged the jury to think about the fact that Martha's death, though sad, wasn't caused by pure evil, but by a moment of uncontrolled fear. There was a lot of information over the next few days. Deputy Callahan was the first person to come forward in court. He carefully explained each step of the probe. He talked about finding Martha's purse, the pieces of fabric, and the area where the body was found. He showed the plan he had made, which showed where the crime happened and how each important place was connected to it. Warren led him through carefully thought-out questions, building a story in order that the jury could easily follow. Elena Hayes talked about the last time she saw Martha living, talking about that normal March afternoon when they talked about the weather in a boring way. Her voice shook as she thought about how Martha didn't seem too tired and showed no signs of the horror that was waiting for her hours later. Ruth Pendleton talked about the whispered scream she had heard in the woods. She said it had been bothering her for weeks before she finally linked it to Martha's missing. Dr. Harrison Mills gave his medical conclusions and talked about the facts in terms that were both technical and easy to understand. Asphyxiation, the marks on Martha's neck, and the fact that she didn't have any other major injuries. Mitchell tried to use the doctor's testimony to his advantage by stressing that there were no signs of long-term or sadistic violence. This was meant to back Mitchell's story of an act that was done without thinking, but Warren quickly countered and reminded the jury that Martha had been scared in her last moments, even though she had died suddenly. Margaret Foster from the boarding house in Sevierville testified. Show the logbook that James signed as James Thornton to talk about his stay. William Dutch, the hunter who found Martha's bag, talked about how he saw something strange in the leaves while he was on the path. Douglas Freeman talked about the time he talked to Martha in Knoxville about her worries about the property issue. The most exciting part was when James's written statement was read out loud in court. Warren made sure to show every page and word of James, signed in Asheville. The confession was long, damning, and hard to ignore. James did not move in his chair while the words were read. He just stared at his hands, which were clasped together in his lap. A few of the jurors frowned, and others lightly shook their heads. While being questioned by the other side, Mitchell did his best. He asked whether James had been forced to sign the statement, whether he was mentally stable at the time, and whether he fully understood what his words meant legally. He was firm, though, and Sheriff Callahan, what he said. Yes, James had admitted after being questioned for hours without being threatened or making false claims. He was awake and aware, and he even seemed happy to finally tell the truth. The defense tried to paint a picture of Martha that made it look like she had some blame for the meeting. Mitchell said she had agreed to meet a stranger in a remote area on her own, and the fact that she had brought cash suggested she was planning to do shady business. However, this line of thought went horribly wrong. The jury members tensed up, and Warren used the chance to stress how disgusting and morally wrong it was to say Martha was to blame for her own death. On the 6th day of the hearing, everyone was ready for the big moment. James Thornton would defend himself by going to the stand. Mitchell told them not to do it because of the risks, but James pressed. It was his wish that people would hear his side of the story straight from him. He might have had some leftover vanity or a real sense of regret that needed to be voiced in public. James swore in a weak voice that he would tell the truth. He sat in the witness chair and gripped the wooden arms so hard that his palms turned white. Mitchell asked him simple questions to learn about his life, including the hard times and bad decisions he had made. James talked about being poor and how he had always looked for easy ways to get rich. He said that hearing about the mining rights seemed like a divine chance. He admitted that he sent the letters to Martha, tricked her into going to the meeting, and planned to get money or property rights from her. But his voice broke at the end. James swore that he had no plans to kill Martha, as tears ran down his face. He said he was scared when she said she would reveal him, that he only wanted to briefly silence her, and that he didn't know how strong he was until it was too late. "I'm not a killer," James said over and over. The emotion in his words. "I'm a thief and a liar, but I'm not a killer." It was a terrible accident, and every day I wish I could go back in time and change everything, Mitchell said. Mitchell stopped questioning him there in the hopes that this show of regret would move at least some of the jury. But then Theodore Warren came up for cross-examination, and the mood in the courtroom changed dramatically. Warren walked slowly to stand in front of James, his eyes fixed on the defendant. Warren's questions were surgical, meant to destroy every part of James' story that he didn't plan the crime. He asked about the weeks of planning and the carefully crafted letters meant to manipulate Martha. He also asked why James had chosen that particular time and that remote location. He asked about the decision to hide the body, take the purse, and steal the money. Each question added to the evidence of cold calculation and planning. Warren then asked the devastating question, "Mr. Thornton, how long did you wait after Martha Whitlock's death before you went back to look for the mining rights contract?" James looked away briefly and then said, "A few days." Warren pressed him, "And how did you feel when you found that contract? Do you feel bad about killing the woman, or happy that you finally got what you wanted?" James couldn't answer. His quiet spoke louder than any words. Warren didn't say anything about the question for a few minutes. Mitchell tried to fix the damage during redirect questions, but it was too late. James's mask of genuine remorse had come off, revealing the calculating opportunist underneath. Closing arguments took place on the 8th day of the trial. Warren spoke for almost 2 hours, methodically going over all the evidence, showing how it all fit together, and showing the clear pattern of. He ended by asking the jury to do what was right for Martha Whitlock, who was innocent and only did wrong by believing what a man wrote about her. The man only saw her as a way to make money, so he wanted to put her to death. Mitchell did his best in his closing argument, appealing to compassion and an understanding of how complicated people are. He said that putting James to death would not bring Martha back, and that recognizing the difference between planned murder and panic-induced homicide was important for the integrity of the trial. But his words didn't ring true when compared to the powerful story Warren had made up. On the morning of the 9th day, Judge Pierce gave the jury its final instructions. His voice was deep and solemn as he talked about the different levels of murder they could consider, the legal definitions of premeditation, and the mitigating circumstances that could change the sentence. The 12 men listened carefully, knowing how important their decisions would be. They then went back to the deliberation room. They would be debating James Thornton's fate for the next few hours in a small room in the back of the courthouse. The wait was agonizing. The gallery stayed full. No one wanted to miss the verdict. Some people brought baskets of food and were ready to stay all day if needed. There were quiet conversations about what the jury would decide. People had different ideas about guilt and the right punishment. Sheriff Callahan stayed seated in a side chair, looking calm, but his fingers were drumming on the table. 4 hours went by before the jury said they were ready. A court official knocked on the door to the judge's chambers, and Pierce came back into the courtroom in his long black robe. The room was called to order, and silence fell like a heavy blanket. James was brought back, his face blank and his eyes far away, as if he had already emotionally disconnected from the outcome. Mitchell briefly put his hand on his shoulder to show support. The jury foreman, Judge Pierce, asked if they had reached a verdict. Samuel Morris, a middle-aged farmer, stood up and held a piece of paper in his hands. "Yes, Your Honor," Morris answered firmly. The whole courtroom held its breath. In the case of the state of Tennessee versus James Thornton for the crime of intentional homicide, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. A murmur could be heard in the halls. Some people agreed and nodded. Some people just let out sighs of relief that the problem was finally solved. "Resolved," the judge said. James didn't react, standing still as if he were stone. Mitchell closed his eyes briefly, accepting the defeat he knew was coming. Warren gave himself a small nod of satisfaction, knowing that justice, at least in the legal sense, had been done. The sentence would be decided in a separate hearing the following week. This gave the defense time to prepare mitigating arguments, though everyone knew they weren't many. At that time in Tennessee, intentional, those found guilty of murder could get the death penalty or life in prison. Mitchell fought to keep the person from being put to death. saying that even criminals should have the chance to change their ways in the future. The sentencing hearing took place on a cold October morning. The trees outside the courthouse were now completely golden, and the wind made the leaves fall in slow spirals. Inside, the mood was even more somber than during the trial. There were no longer arguments about guilt or innocence, just the cold question of. Mitchell showed letters from James's family, including one from Sarah Thornton and another from Elias himself, pleading for mercy. Both letters acknowledged how bad the crimes were but asked that James's life not be spared. Elias wrote that he had forgiven his brother and that, despite everything, he still thought there was some good in him that was worth keeping. The letters were read out loud, and some people in the gallery seemed really moved. Warren called his own last witness, Martha's cousin, Helen Cartwright. Helen walked up to the dais wearing black, her eyes red from recent tears. She spoke of Martha in a controlled but emotional way, saying that she was a kind, hard-working woman who never hurt anyone and who deserved to live much longer than the 28 years she had. Helen said that Martha had simple dreams, like one day getting married, having a family, and growing old in peace. All of these things were taken away from her by a man who was driven by pure greed. I don't. When Helen looked at James directly for the first time, she said, I don't want revenge, but I do want justice. Martha can't speak for herself, so I speak for her. Her life had value. Her death shouldn't be minimized or forgotten. No matter what the sentence is, it will show that my cousin's life mattered, and that killing an innocent person has consequences. Judge Pierce listened carefully and took notes from time to time. When all the testimony was over, he asked James if he had anything to say. The chains around James's ankles jingled as he slowly stood up. He looked at Helen, then at the judge, and finally at the jury that had found him guilty. There are no words, James began sadly, that can undo what I did. I took a life I had no right to take. I've spent my whole life looking for shortcuts, avoiding responsibility, and always thinking only of myself. Martha Whitlock paid the ultimate price for my greed and cowardice. He paused and swallowed hard. I deserve whatever punishment this court hands out. Please use my story to warn others who might be going down the same path. Greed eats everything, and in the end, all that's left is regret and chains. Judge Pierce thanked James and asked him to take a seat. He then used the power that the state of Tennessee had given him to pronounce the sentence. James Thornton would spend the rest of his life in prison at the Tennessee State Penitentiary in Nashville, without the chance of parole. James didn't say anything dramatic. He just nodded as if he had expected that. Mitchell put his hand on the condemned man's shoulder for a moment, as a final act of kindness before leading him back to his cell. Warren carefully organized his papers, happy that the case had come to a proper end. Judge Pierce slammed his gavel one last time to end the session. Over the next few weeks, life in Newport slowly returned to normal. People occasionally talked about Martha Whitlock's case, but it wasn't a big part of everyday life. Autumn turned into winter, and snow covered the Appalachians like a silent blanket. The small house where Martha had lived was empty for months before Helen decided to sell it. Helen Cartwright used some of the money from the mineral rights to start a small fund in honor of Martha to help single women in Newport who needed help setting up their own businesses. It was a small but meaningful way to make sure that something good came out of this terrible tragedy. The fund would continue to work for decades, giving many women the chance to be independent, like Martha never had the chance to be. Sheriff Callahan kept the case file very well organized in his office. On quiet nights, he would sometimes go back and read testimony and look at evidence again, not because he had to for work, but because something about the case scared him. It could have been the cruel randomness with which Martha was picked as a victim, or it could have been the memory of how her body lay in that clearing, so alone in the mountains she had known her whole life. James Thornton was sent to Nashville on a cold November morning. The train ride took several hours and went through the mountains he had explored with such evil intentions. When he got to the penitentiary, a stone complex that looked more like a medieval fortress than a modern prison, James finally understood how bad things were. He would be stuck inside those walls until he died, living a life of monotony and isolation for decades. After James Thornton's trial, there was a heavy silence in Newport. The community slowly healed, like a deep wound that leaves a mark even after it heals. People went back to working in the fields, going to church, and raising their children. But Martha Whitlock's case stayed in people's minds as a grim reminder that evil can reach even the bravest. The Nashville Penitentiary became James Thornton's whole world. The first few weeks there were a rough adjustment to life in prison. His cell, which he shared with another prisoner, was about 10 feet by 14 feet and had 2 narrow beds, a small sink, and a window that was too high to see the outside world. Instead of the silence of the mountains, he heard metal doors slamming all the time, voices resonating through the stone hallways, and the never-ending noise. When guards made rounds, James was put to work in the prison's carpentry shop, where other prisoners made simple furniture that was sold to state institutions. It was mind-numbing, repetitive work, just the kind of thing that happened every day in prison. He got up early, worked 8 hours, ate bland food in noisy cafeterias, and spent his nights in his cell thinking about the choices that had led him there. As the months went by, James started writing every day. He wrote about his memories and thoughts in cheap notebooks that he bought with the little money he made from his job. His words were a confusing mix of confession, justification, and real regret. He wrote a lot about Martha, trying to figure out why he had done what he had and how one moment of panic had destroyed 2 lives. In 1923, 2 years after his conviction, James got a letter from Martha's cousin, Helen Cartwright. She wrote that she had been struggling with herself for. Helen thought for months about whether to write to James, but in the end she decided she had to say some things. Her letter didn't ask for forgiveness. That was clear from the start. Instead, she wrote about how important it was for James to fully understand Martha as a person, not just as a victim. Helen talked about Martha's childhood, including how she lost her parents young and had to learn to be independent quickly. She also talked about Martha's hopes to grow her sewing business and maybe open a bigger shop. Helen wrote to James in Knoxville about Martha's love of poetry and how she used to carefully keep notebooks with poems she liked. She wanted James to know that he had killed not just a name on legal papers, but a whole woman with hopes, fears, joys, and sorrows. The letter broke James's heart in a way that the court ruling hadn't. Reading about Martha's humanity, the little things about her life made her crime seem much more real. He wrote back to Helen weeks later, but only thanked her for taking the time to write. Helen never replied, and James didn't expect her to. That conversation had served its purpose. Years turned into decades behind those stone walls. James aged faster than most long-term prisoners. His hair turned completely white before he turned 50. Deep wrinkles covered his face, and the damp, poorly ventilated prison air gave him a persistent cough. He kept working as a carpenter as long as his health would allow, finding comfort in his work. Elias Thornton only went to see his brother James once, in 1927. It was a painful and awkward meeting, with iron bars and the unbridgeable chasm of James's crime separating the 2 men. Elias said he had come to say goodbye in person because he was planning to move with Sarah to Oregon, where job opportunities seemed better. He also said that he had forgiven James not because he agreed with what he had done, but because he was sick of holding anger against James. James thanked his brother with tears in his eyes. They briefly talked about their childhoods and the parents they had both lost so long ago. They also talked about how different paths in life can lead to different outcomes. When Elias left, James knew he would probably never see his brother again. It was like cutting the last thread that connected him to the outside world. Sheriff Callahan retired in 1930 after almost 25 years of service to Cockey County. During his last week on the job, he made one last trip to the property where Martha had been found. The clearing was no longer recognizable because plants had taken over the whole area. New trees had grown where the ground had been bare, and there was no sign of the terrible events that had happened there. Callahan stood there for almost an hour, just watching shadows move across the forest floor and listening to the wind whisper through the leaves. He thought of all the lives this case had touched, all the questions that had been answered, and all the questions that would never be answered. He thought of Martha, a woman he had never met in real life but felt he knew very well from months of research. Before he left, he said a silent prayer. He wasn't a very religious man, but he felt that this place needed some recognition. Records show that James Thornton died at the Tennessee State Penitentiary in March 1941, at the age of 59. The official cause of death was pneumonia, but his body and spirit were worn out from 20 years of confinement. He was buried in. His headstone only had his name and the date of death. It didn't have any fancy writing on it. Newport kept going on as it always had, a small mountain town where seasons change and generations succeed. Martha Whitlock's story slowly turned into a local legend, told in more and more skewed ways by people who weren't there when the events happened. Some details were exaggerated, others were forgotten, until only the main idea remained. An innocent woman was killed. Someone else's greed killed someone, but in the end, justice was done. Over the years, the Whitlock estate changed hands several times. The mineral rights were never fully used because of technical issues or changes in the market. That yellowed contract that killed Martha wasn't worth as much as James thought it was. This may have been a poetic irony, or it may have just shown that greed is often based on illusions as well as reality. In Tennessee, you'll find a city that has grown but still has a lot of its original charm. The Appalachians still surround the valley, and the trails still disappear into the trees. Downtown, there's a small historical museum with records of important events in the area, including a section about what happened in 1921. There, you can see faded photos of the courthouse where James was tried, copies of articles from the Newport Plain Talk, and even one of the Sheriff Callahan used maps during the investigation. There is a photo by Martha Whitlock, one of the few that exists, of a young woman with a serious face, as was common at the time. Her eyes stared directly into the camera, unaware that this would be the only picture of her face that people would ever see. Martha Whitlock's story reminds us of some uncomfortable truths about people. Greed can turn people into monsters, and trust can be used against you. Tragedies can happen anywhere, even in small towns. But it also reminds us of how strong communities can be, how important justice is even when it can't fix the wrong, and how memory keeps the worth of those we have lost. The mountains that watched those terrible events in March 1921 have stayed the same, oblivious to the human dramas that happened in their shadows. They were there before Martha was born, during her short life, and for decades after she died.